In the early hours of February 13, 2025, the village of Meba in Lubero Territory, North Kivu, Democratic Republic of the Congo, experienced an unfathomable tragedy that would forever scar its community. Militants from the Allied Democratic Forces, ADF, an Islamist group with ties to the Islamic State, orchestrated a brutal attack that led to the abduction and subsequent massacre of at least 70 Christian civilians. Around 4 a.m., as the villagers of Meba slept, ADF militants stealthily entered the community. They approached homes, instructing residents to get out and don't make any noise. This tactic of surprise and intimidation left the villagers with little choice but to comply. Initially, 20 Christian men and women were captured, but as the militants advanced, they abducted an additional 50 individuals, bringing the total to at least 70 captives. The abducted villagers were forced to march to the nearby village of Kasanga. The journey, undertaken under duress and fear, culminated at a Protestant church in Kasanga. This sacred place, a symbol of faith and community, was tragically transformed into the site of their execution. Inside the church, the ADF militants carried out a gruesome act of violence. The captives, including women, children, and the elderly, were beheaded with machetes. This method of execution was not only brutal but also intended to instill terror among the local population and send a chilling message to the broader Christian community in the region. The aftermath of the massacre was discovered on February 14, 2025, when the decapitated bodies of the 70 Christians were found inside the Protestant church in Kasanga. The discovery sent shockwaves through the local and international communities, highlighting the severe persecution faced by Christians in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The ADF, originally based in Uganda, has been operating in the Democratic Republic of the Congo for over a decade. Their affiliation with the Islamic State has emboldened their actions, leading to increased violence and instability in the region. This attack is part of a broader pattern of violence targeting Christian communities in North Kivu province, aiming to destabilize the region and suppress religious diversity. The Allied Democratic Forces, ADF, is a notorious militant group responsible for ongoing violence and instability in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, and Uganda. Originally formed in Uganda in the 1990s, the group has evolved into one of the most brutal armed factions in Central Africa, carrying out mass killings, abductions, and terrorist attacks, often targeting Christians and civilians. The ADF was founded in 1995 in Uganda by Jamil Mukalu, a former Catholic who converted to Islam and became radicalized. The group initially emerged as an alliance of several rebel factions opposed to the Ugandan government of Yoweri Museveni. Mukalu, influenced by extremist ideologies, sought to establish an Islamic state in Uganda. However, after facing military defeats in Uganda, the ADF fled into the eastern DRC, where it has since operated as an insurgency, taking advantage of the region's dense forests and weak governance. For years, the ADF functioned as a regional insurgent group, but in 2019, its operations took a darker turn. The group pledged allegiance to the Islamic State, ISIS, and rebranded itself as the Islamic State Central Africa Province, ISCAP. This affiliation led to increased brutality in their attacks, including beheadings, bombings, and mass abductions, mirroring ISIS tactics in the Middle East. The connection to ISIS also provided the ADF with international jihadist networks, funding, and strategic guidance, making them even more lethal. The United States designated the ADF as a terrorist organization in 2021, reinforcing global concerns over its growing influence. The ADF is infamous for its extreme brutality. Their attacks typically involve massacres. Entire villages are slaughtered, often in churches or homes. Victims are beheaded or burned alive. Kidnappings, women and children are abducted, with many forced into slavery or conscripted as fighters. Church attacks, Christian communities, particularly in the North Kivu and Ituri provinces, are specifically targeted. Suicide bombings. ADF militants have carried out suicide attacks in cities like Beni, a tactic learned from their ISIS connections. One of their worst massacres took place in May 2024, when at least 50 Christians were killed in a brutal overnight raid in Beni, North Kivu. Churches were set ablaze, and pastors were executed. The ADF's ideology is deeply rooted in radical Islam, and it views Christianity as an enemy to be eradicated. Churches, pastors, and Christian villages are frequently attacked because they represent resistance to the group's extremist vision. Revelation 2 verse 10 reminds believers of the persecution they may face. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Despite the fear, the church in the DRC continues to stand firm, with many believers choosing to remain in dangerous areas to spread the gospel. Efforts to combat the ADF have been ongoing for years. The Congolese Army, FARDC, and Ugandan forces launched joint operations in 2021, but the militants continue to evade capture, using the forests as cover. The massacre in Meba and Kasanga drew international condemnation. Religious organizations, human rights groups, and governments around the world expressed their outrage and solidarity with the victims. The incident underscored the urgent need for increased security measures and humanitarian assistance in the Democratic Republic of the Congo to protect vulnerable communities from such atrocities. The United Nations and African Union have condemned the ADF's actions, but limited resources and a lack of government control in the DRC have made eradication difficult. Meanwhile, Christian organizations like Open Doors and Voice of the Martyrs are working to support persecuted believers, providing aid, trauma counseling, and helping rebuild destroyed churches. The ADF remains one of the most dangerous terrorist organizations in Africa, but despite their violence, the faith of persecuted Christians in the DRC remains unshaken. As Romans 8 verses 35 to 37 declares, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us." The massacre in Meba and Kasanga is not just another news story. It is a heart-wrenching reality, a call that should shake us to our very core. These were fathers, mothers, and children who woke up that day expecting to see the next morning. They had dreams just like us. Some were farmers, others were shopkeepers, and many were simply trying to survive in a land that has known more war than peace. But they were also followers of Christ, and for that, they paid the ultimate price. Their crime? Loving Jesus. Their last words? Perhaps cries for mercy. Perhaps silent prayers. Perhaps the name of Christ on their lips as they took their final breath. And now they are gone. Their bodies buried beneath the soil. Their blood staining the ground where they once walked, laughed, and worshipped. The world will move on. Another tragedy will take its place in the headlines. But we cannot move on, not without letting their sacrifice change us. We must respond. We must pray as if lives depend on it, because they do. For many of us, prayer can feel like an afterthought, something we do before meals, before bed, or during church services. But for persecuted believers, prayer is as essential as air. It is what sustains them when they are hiding in the forests, when they hear gunfire in the distance, and when they wonder if they will live to see another day. They don't ask us to pray that the persecution stops. They ask us to pray for strength to endure. Pray for those who are still alive, still hiding, still running. Many Christians in these regions are displaced, wandering through forests without food, water, or shelter. Some are wounded but cannot seek medical help for fear of being found. Ask God to be their provider, their healer, their refuge. Pray for the families of the martyrs. Imagine the grief of a mother who just lost her son, of a child whose father was just taken from them. Pray that the Holy Spirit would comfort them as he promised in Matthew 5 verse 4. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Pray for the persecutors. It may feel unnatural, even offensive, to pray for those who commit such atrocities. But Jesus commanded us to do so in Matthew 5 verse 44. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Pray that their hearts would be softened, that they would have dreams and visions of Christ, and that, like Saul, they would be transformed into instruments of God's kingdom. Do not pray casually. Pray fervently. Pray as if you were in their shoes. Pray as if it were your own family being slaughtered. Pray as if it were your church being burned down. We must be their voice in a world that chooses silence. The world will not talk about them. Governments will issue statements of condemnation, but nothing will change. The news cycle will move on, but we must not be silent. Share their stories. Speak about it in your church. Post about it on social media. Let people know that in the heart of Africa, our brothers and sisters are dying for their faith. Educate yourself and others. Many people have never heard of the persecution happening in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and other parts of the world. Learn about it and educate others. Advocate for them. Write to government officials. Support organizations that fight for religious freedom. Raise awareness in any way you can. Every time we share their stories, we honor their memory. We must support the work of the gospel with action. The persecuted church does not just need our prayers, they need our help. While we enjoy the comfort of our homes, many of them are homeless. While we sit in our churches, many of them have no church left. Their suffering is real, and their needs are urgent. How can we help? Give to ministries that serve persecuted Christians. Organizations like Open Doors, International Christian Concern, and Voice of the Martyrs are actively working to provide aid, rebuild communities, and support families of martyrs. Help rebuild what was destroyed. Many churches have been burned to the ground. Many homes have been reduced to ashes. By supporting Christian organizations, we can help restore what the enemy has tried to erase. Support missions. There are still brave men and women risking their lives to bring the gospel to these regions. They need our financial and spiritual support. We cannot all go to the mission field, but we can all do something. Imagine for a moment that you are a Christian in Meba or Kasanga. It is a quiet evening. Your children are asleep. The village is peaceful. The sound of crickets fills the air. You sit with your family, perhaps reading scripture, perhaps singing a hymn softly. Then suddenly gunfire, screams, the sound of machetes clashing against bone. You rush to grab your children, to hide, to run. But it is too late. They have already surrounded your home. The door is kicked open. You are dragged outside. The smell of smoke fills your nostrils as the church burns in the distance. A masked man points a weapon at you. Deny Christ and you will live, he says. What would you do? Would you renounce your faith to save your life? Or would you stand firm, knowing that this moment might be your last? This is not a hypothetical question for our persecuted brothers and sisters. This is their reality. And yet they do not deny him. They choose death over denial. They choose Christ over comfort. They choose eternity over the fleeting breath of this life. What is our excuse? In the West, we have the freedom to worship. We have Bibles in every translation. We have churches on every street corner. And yet, how often do we take it for granted? How often do we skip church because we are too tired? How often do we neglect our Bibles because we are too busy? How often do we keep silent about Jesus because we are afraid of offending someone? If these persecuted believers had the freedoms we have, what would they do with them? They would treasure every moment in the presence of God. They would devour His Word. They would boldly share the gospel. And yet, here we are, comfortable, complacent, distracted by the trivial things of this world while our brothers and sisters are bleeding for their faith. This should not be. Their faith should challenge us. Their sacrifice should awaken us. Their courage should convict us. The blood of the martyrs is not in vain. Jesus said in Revelation 2 verse 10, "Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life." The martyrs of Meba and Kasanga did not die in vain. Their blood is a testimony. Their sacrifice is a seed that will bear fruit for generations to come. Now, the question is, what will we do with their sacrifice? Will we let it inspire us to live more boldly for Christ? Will we let it move us to action? Or will we just scroll past, unaffected, unchanged? The choice is ours. May we not waste it.